Aloha! Welcome to another episode of the Screwtape Letters Lenten Series. I'm Jay Goodman, and my podcast is called Talking with a Good Man. It's time for letter 14, and my good friend and Coast Guard officer, Rob Hayes, to give an amazing commentary on letter 14. So I wanted to give him an introduction fit for a greatly respected Coast Guard officer, but who is also a very humble and true good man, and a close personal friend of mine, Rob Hayes. Welcome back, everyone. So in this episode, we are going to tackle one of the toughest things for us to deal with in this life, and that is humility, being humble. The theme for today is humble thyself. And it's like I said, it's the hardest thing in this world to handle, to deal with, to get ourselves to be in that state, while also tapping into our magnanimity, which is being great at, with what you're good at in life. And the verse is, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that in due time he may exalt you." And that's from 1 Peter 5:6. Now let's read letter 14. This is letter 14 in the Screwtape letters. My dear Wormwood, the most alarming thing in your last account of the patient is that he is making none of those confident resolutions which marked his original conversion. No more lavish promises of perpetual virtue, I gather. Not even the expectation of an endowment of grace for life, but only a hope for the daily and hourly pittance to meet the daily and hourly temptations. This is very bad. I see only one thing to do at the moment. Your patient has become humble. Have you drawn his attention to the fact? All virtues are less formidable to us once the man is aware that he has them. But this is especially true of humility. Catch him at the moment when he is really poor in spirit and smuggle into his mind the gratifying reflection, by Jove, I'm being humble. And almost immediately pride at his own humility will appear. If he awakens to the danger and tries to smother this new form of pride, make him proud of his attempt. And so on through as many stages as you please. But don't try this too long, for fear you awake his sense of humor and proportion, in which case he will merely laugh at you and go to bed. But there are other profitable ways of fixing his attention on the virtue of humility. By this virtue, as by all the others, our enemy wants to turn the man's attention away from self to him, and to the man's neighbors. All the abjection and self-hatred are designed in the long run solely for this end. Unless they attain this end, they do us little harm. And they may even do us good if they keep the man concerned with himself, and above all, if self-contempt can be made the starting point for contempt of other selves, and thus for gloom, cynicism, and cruelty. You must therefore conceal from the patient the true end of humility. Let him think of it not as self-forgetfulness, but as a certain kind of opinion, namely a low opinion, of his own talents and character. Some talents, I gather, he really has. Fix in his mind the idea that humility consists in trying to believe those talents to be less valuable than he believes them to be. No doubt they are, in fact, less valuable than he believes, but that is not the point. The great thing is to make him value an opinion for some quality other than truth, thus introducing an element of dishonesty and make-believe into the heart of what otherwise threatens to become a virtue. By this method, thousands of humans have been brought to think that humility means pretty women trying to believe they are ugly, and clever men trying to believe they are fools. And since what they are trying to believe may in some cases be manifest nonsense, they cannot succeed in believing it, and we have the chance of keeping their minds endlessly revolving on themselves in an effort to achieve the impossible. To anticipate the enemy's strategy, we must consider his aims. The enemy wants to bring the man to a state of mind in which he could design the best cathedral in the world, and know it to be the best, and rejoice in the fact, without being any more or less, or otherwise glad at having done it than he would be if it had been done by another. The enemy wants him, in the end, to be so free from any bias in his own favor that he can rejoice in his own talents as frankly and gratefully as in his neighbor's talents, or in a sunrise, an elephant, or a waterfall. He wants each man, in the long run, to be able to recognize all creatures, even himself, as glorious and excellent things. He wants to kill their animal self-love as soon as possible, but it is his long-term policy, I fear, to restore to them a new kind of self-love, a charity and gratitude for all selves, including their own. When they have really learned to love their neighbors as themselves, they will be allowed to love themselves as their neighbors. For we must never forget what is the most repellent and inexplicable trait in our enemy. He really loves the hairless bipeds he has created, and always gives back to them with his right hand what he has taken away with his left. His whole effort, therefore, will be to get the man's mind off the subject of his own value altogether. He would rather the man thought himself a great architect or a great poet, and then forget about it, than that he should spend much time and pains trying to think himself a bad one. Your efforts to instill either vain glory or false modesty into the patient will therefore be met from the enemy's side with the obvious reminder that a man is not usually called upon to have an opinion of his own talents at all, since he can very well go on improving them to the best of his ability without deciding on his own precise niche in the temple of fame. You must try to exclude this reminder from the patient's consciousness at all costs. The enemy will also try to render real in the patient's mind a doctrine which they all profess but find it difficult to bring home to their feelings, the doctrine that they did not create themselves, that their talents were given them, and that they might as well be proud of the color of their hair. But always and by all methods the enemy's aim will be to get the patient's mind off such questions, and yours will be to fix it on them. Even of his sins, the enemy does not want him to think too much. Once they are repented, the sooner the man turns his attention outward, the better the enemy is pleased. Your affectionate uncle, Screwtape. And that was letter 14. Now we're going to have a commentary by Rob Hayes. Rob Hayes is a husband, father, grandfather, and retired Coast Guard officer. He and his wife Kathy met in high school in Connecticut. They've been married for 34 years and have 5 adult children and 12 grandchildren. Last year he retired from a 33-year military career. He and his wife have enjoyed doing marriage preparation, youth ministry, and religious education, pro-life, and various other church-related activities over the course of their marriage. In retirement in Maryland, he's enjoying being a grandpa. He's a leadership coach, and he mentors, and just capturing Coast Guard history and lots of reading. So with that, I'd like to introduce Rob Hayes.
Hey, Rob.
How are you, Jason?
Good. How are you doing?
Good.
I'm
Back on your lanai there, right?
Yep. How's Kathy and everybody?
Doing well. We trying to think what's big news for us, but yeah, lately it's a good amount of travel. We're going out to Pittsburgh tomorrow to visit 2 of our kids who live out in that area, and several of the grandkids. And then last week we're out. Our oldest daughter lives out about 2 hours from us in Virginia, so it was a day trip out there. So a lot of time seeing the grandkids.
Thanks for doing this. And I'll say, Rob, he, in March of 2020 when COVID's hit, we started our men's group together, and he was the first one to join in. And then it grew from 2 of us to, I think 25 came at one time, and an average of 8 to 12, every time we meet. And he was the patriarch of our group, one of them. And
You call me old, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, one thing about Rob is he's a humble guy, man. You'd never know his accomplishments unless you really press him and put his arm behind his back. Tell me what you've done.
Well, to quote Screwtape in here, he's like, yes, I take a lot of pride in my own humility, right? That's
yeah.
No, that's actually something we can easily fall into. So I think I'd be a little cautious on lavishing too much praise on how humble I am, because as I reflected for this, I realized there's a lot of ways I'm not humble and that I need to keep working on. And that's come to me through prayer, through some spiritual direction, and going to confession, and really just, all of us, we're working out our salvation with fear and trepidation, but working on it, hopefully gaining in holiness throughout our life. But some things are hard to overcome. Some of our foibles and temptations and faults that we fall into, including pride, which is really one of the primary root sins, really.
So Rod's a very close personal friend of mine and my family. He's the confirmation sponsor for my son, or was.
Yep, for what your middle. Yep, Dominic. Yep.
Yeah, one of the best sponsors, because you keep in touch with him and you encourage him and spur him on, and that's rare amongst confirmation sponsors.
I'll just say one of the ironies is, I sent your son, if you don't mind me sharing this, I was looking like, hey, let me send him something, for his birthday a couple months ago. And I asked one of my daughters, who has been both a religion teacher and a high school youth minister, said, what would be a good gift for like a teenage boy? And she's like, you know what? I find Screwtape Letters is a good book that teens like. And so, hey, that's a great idea, Rebecca, because I'd read that with one of my men's groups probably about 5 years ago. So I ordered a copy of Screwtape Letters and sent it, and it was just amazing. It's kind of like, this is kind of eerie because you were just about to kick off reading that with your sons, and as well as kick this off, and we had not communicated at that point. So it's kind of like God works in amazing ways sometimes, because I had no idea you were going to do that, and that was the book that I sent to Dominic. So
yeah, we were literally starting that night with Screwtape 1, and he's like, "What's this? I got this package from Mr. Hayes," and I said, "Open it. Let's see what it is." It feels like a book, and Screwtape Letters, and I teared up. I'm like, "You've got to be kidding me! This is amazing!"
Yeah.
Wow.
I find this a good one because it's pride, like I mentioned, pride and selfishness. Really, it's at the heart of all sin, and then humility being the virtue that's opposed to that pride that we really need to work on. Now, pride can be a positive thing, right? We should take pride in our work. It inspires us to do better. We're proud of accomplishments of those around us, but obviously it needs to be kept in check and kept in moderation. And that's kind of when we read chapter 14 here in Screwtape, and how he's working, that joke, that I read there, but taking pride in our humility. Wow, I'm really being humble, but focusing on that and taking pride in that. It's that's not the example of humility really there. And then later he talks about, humility means getting, a pretty woman to think that she's ugly, or a clever man to think that he's a fool. And that's really a false humility. God doesn't expect us to not appreciate the gifts that he has given us, but it's to keep them in perspective and realize the source and give thanks to him for that. And if you're a great architect, not to brag about it, but just to do good things for the glory of God as an architect. Or if you're a good athlete, same thing, give glory to God, or a good leader, or a good dad, or whatever. And so, but yeah, Satan, and viewed through the lens of this book, tries to fix in our mind a belief that our talents are less valuable than they really are. And it's a warping of humility, really. And so it's kind of neat, as we've been going through Screwtape Letters, to see the multiple different ways that Satan and the other evil spirits attack us. And so I thought I'd do is just talk about some of the things, because one of the things I think a lot of us think, I'm a very humble person, right? I'm not out there, bragging about myself and all that, but I have found, I'll just give some examples. And these are things that at different times I have wrestled with, and I've gone to confession for, and in spiritual direction, and just different ways that you might not necessarily think of that are signs of pride. And, but they are. So, sometimes getting frustrated at our own mistakes, it's a form of perfectionism, really. And if you think about it, and I've had a confessor, spiritual director tell me, he's like, nobody's perfect. And so when you make mistakes and you get mad at yourself, you get impatient, you get frustrated, that's really a source of pride really there, because you're expecting that you're never going to make mistakes, and you're not really embracing the cross that Jesus is giving you to carry there. So don't get mad at that. Being hypersensitive to feedback or criticism, and particularly when you're very impatient and have a great dislike for being contradicted or corrected. I mean, I think a lot of us, sometimes that may happen within our family relationships, where our kids or our wife, might give us feedback and they mean it in a way, but you get short-tempered and you get impatient back to them. Well, that's a form of pride there as well, because just being able to take feedback from somebody in the spirit that it's meant, and even if it's not given in a good spirit, to take it and just say thank you for the feedback, rather than feeling you need to lash back at somebody or to be sarcastic back to them. Sarcasm as well as can be, and I'm very guilty of that. Jason, you know that very well, because I can be very sarcastic with you. That's a form of pride as well, when taken too far of an extent. Certainly wanting credit or notice for the things that we do. I mean, really, we should know that the Lord knows the things that we're doing, and we don't need to be telling everybody. But have you ever felt yourself in conversations trying to kind of work that into the conversation so that somebody knows, whether it's something you did for somebody else, money that you're giving to a charity, this new effort that you're doing, how you're growing in spirituality, things like that. I mean, it's good to share those things to help build each other up, but there's also a time when it kind of gets too far, and you kind of take on, or where you're just trying to, hey, look at me, beating your chest and saying how good you are. I don't know if you get Magnificat, but a while ago, it's something we've been getting for years and years. And Kathy and I do evening prayer, and then as well as other prayers. Bishop Barron, several months ago, had these one-page stories in there, and it's just so wonderful. It's just really a good crystallization of this. He talks about how in parable in the 6th chapter of Luke, removing a plank in one's own eye. When you talk about, you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, and you're ignoring the plank in your own eye. He says it's one of the most psychologically and spiritually insightful remarks in the New Testament. Let's face it, the favorite indoor pastime of most human beings is the criticism of others, isn't it? I mean, it's gossip, yeah. But whether it's in your mind or with others, he says we positively delight in pointing out the failures, foibles, moral failings, and annoying tendencies of our neighbors. This is, of course, a function of pride and egotism. The more I put someone else down, the more elevated I feel. But it is also, oddly, a magnificent means of turning a mirror on ourselves to see what usually remains unseen. Why, we ought to ask, do we find precisely this sin of others particularly annoying? Why does this tick or trait or sin of somebody else especially gall us? Undoubtedly, Jesus implies because it reminds us of a similar failing in ourselves. And I'd really never thought about that before, but he goes on, I remember years ago during a retreat, the spiritual director asked each of us to call to mind a person that we found uniquely hard to take, and then to recount in some detail the characteristics of that person that made him or her so obnoxious to us. He says, I confess that we entered into this exercise with some relish. You can imagine, I was like, oh yeah, boy, that, Jason, whatever, he really gets under my skin. But then the director made this devastating recommendation. Now I want each of you to return to your rooms and ask God to forgive you for those very faults in yourself. His words were as unnerving and as illuminating as Jesus's. I remember reading that a while ago, and I just ripped it out. When we got to the end of the month, I just ripped that out of that month's version of Magnificat, and I just kind of held on to that. And occasionally I'll reread it, because that is, oftentimes when we find a fault in somebody else, when you step back and think about it, not always, but often, it's actually a fault that we have. It may not be in the same measure, maybe a little bit more obvious with somebody, but it's often a fault that we have. And we should really step back and say, why am I harping on them? And realize that, that's a form of pride. We're putting them down, and, really we're as guilty of that as well. So anyway, it just, those are just some. I mean, there's obviously a lot more. And I would say even on a societal level, there's examples of pride in, how we, in some ways, exclude God from kind of like public discourse, kind of pushing him out. That's a form of pride, more as a society, a nation, an organization. Sometimes with technology, there can be this seducing effect where we think that we can do so many things, we can control so many things, even about the human body and sexuality with technology. Look how smart we are as a human race now. Look at all the things we've discovered and we can manipulate. We're kind of we've gotten into that, but we're edging even more into an area where that's a pride against the natural law, and against what God has created, really. So anyway, those are some thoughts I've got. So any comments from you?
Well, that was awesome. I was thinking while you were talking how in the men's group we always brought up pride and humility, and then magnanimity, knowing that we were made for greatness and we are good at things, but to hold it not in a prideful sense, but to not sit on the side because you're too scared to step in the game, And I'm humble. I'm just going to sit on the side and do nothing. I don't want to be known. But then to say, no, I really am good at A, B, C, and I can help with this, and step in the game and say, I'm good at this. Can I help? And that's not being prideful, but it could easily become pride. And all of us men were always checking each other all the time. If one of us got out of the line, Rob, people were right there. No, we were right there to say, hey, calm down. Don't elevate yourself too much. And that we were all open to receiving that criticism, from each other, and being a band of brothers like that.
Yeah, actually, that's a great point, because God gave us these gifts, and He wants us to be generous with them, and that's I think, like you said, how you use your talents, how you use your gifts, but not taking the glory yourself, realizing that it's God working through you. You're being God's hands, you're being God's eyes, you're being God's ears when you help other people and you do things. But it's not not for our glory; it's for His glory. And really, what does God call us to be? In Mark chapter 10, it's the faith of children, the simplicity of children, right? When Jesus, says, "The children come to me," but He expects us. And what is a child's faith? What is a child's, child trusts in their parents, particularly a young kid, with they believe what we tell them, right? They know that we're going to provide for them. They trust when we tell them something, it's going to happen. That's the faith that we're called to have, very simplistic. So sometimes I think we can even, in our spiritual growth, become prideful, like, look at how much I know, or look at how much I'm learning or growing. Really, as much as you feel you have grown, there's, I just read, St. Teresa of Avila recently, and I'm reading, some other books. It's amazing how far, how deep they went in their faith. And it's a reminder that there's so much more that we can grow in our faith. So don't pat yourself on the back like, hey, well, look at me. I'm going to mass extra. I'm reading that. Those are good things, but where is it bringing you? Where does it bring you to a stronger, deeper relationship with the Lord and a trust in Him? So,
what do you think about? It says, Screwtape said, "You must therefore conceal from the patient the true end of humility." And I thought it's interesting. We talk about humility and pride, and what is the true end of it, and that they try to distort it.
Yeah, they do. You kind of misshape it as far as what it, it's not a disparaging of the gifts that God's given us. It's a gratefulness. And really, I think maybe I could be off a little bit on this, but I think, as we grow in humility, we become more and more reliant on the Lord, and more submit to His will to use us as He sees fit. So it might be we have some talents. I'm watching the Chosen series. I don't know if you've seen that. We at our church, we're going through an episode a week. We're in season 2 right now, and it really brings it alive. But it's also an example of how do we submit ourselves to God's will? But even the apostles who were right around Jesus, it took them a while to even though they might have seen some things, it took them a while to really appreciate who He was and understand. But even then, they're not Simon Peter is still he's brash, he's full of action and whatever. And just one example of many there. And Jesus called each of them for different reasons, different skills, different talents. And it may not be the things that they thought were their strengths. It may be totally something different that He needed them to do. And they really had to subjugate and really remove their own will, their own desire, and realize I've got to be serving Jesus. And so true humility is we get better at that, trying to understand the will of God, submitting to it, and living it out. So. As I mentioned, because I was at Mass earlier this week, the gospel was from Matthew, and it was the scribes and the Pharisees, and Jesus was saying, do what they tell you to do, but don't act as they do because of all the things they do. But it ended with, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, whoever humbles himself will be exalted. It was like, man, it just, humility, pride, selfishness. That theme is covered a lot, particularly in the Gospels, because I think it's one of the seven primary sins. And so I think it's kind of the root of most other sins, because selfishness really gets to the heart of, when you're, whether it's gluttony or lust or anger, it's really you're being selfish about something. And so that's kind of a root sin. I think that's a term that some spiritual directors use at times, as far as, helping people kind of get at and try to, with God's help, eradicate, the sins that we tend to fall into more readily. So.
Thank you, Rob, for honoring us with your words of wisdom. Absolutely amazing. Thank you. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you for tuning in. If you could do me the honor of liking this video, commenting below, and subscribing, please. I would be most grateful. It helps me get higher in the Google ratings so more people see these videos. If you want to get a hold of me, my email, as always, is jaygoodman.deepadventure@gmail.com. I love constructive criticism. I really do. I can only get better with your help and feedback. If something's bad, please let me know. If something's good, I would appreciate that too. If you want to donate, my Venmo is at JAYGoodman75. Check out bearschoolofmanliness.com. There is so much amazing content on there designed to help us grow, closer to God and be a strong man amongst other strong men. There's also a section called Mama Bears for the moms out there to support, strengthen, and encourage each other. And as an added bonus, I am going to begin production after Lent to start an entirely new section on the website and the ministry. So stay tuned for that. Now about the drawing again. Remember, on April 13th, the day before the last letter, letter 31, which is on the 14th, I'm going to go through all the comments and pull all the names of people that commented and literally put them into a long ride home hat, the one you see me wearing sometimes. And I'm going to draw a name on April 14th, the last day. But there must be 100 comments for me to do the drawing. The winner is going to receive a long ride home hat, not the one I own, but a different one that's clean. And the C.S. Lewis Complete Signature Classics, exactly like the one I use in the show, and a copy of Marlon De La Torre's study guide. I'll see you all tomorrow, and I hope your Lent is going well. I hope you are learning a lot as we go through this Lenten cleanse together. Pray for me, I'll pray for you, and I look forward to tomorrow. Have a great day.